Social media and politics, up next on Carpe Diem. Hello and welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Merrill Brown, Director of the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. Joining me today is Dr. Joel Penny, Assistant Professor in the School of Communication and Media, specializing in new media, critical cultural studies, and political communication and theory. Joel is an active blogger and frequent pundit and is currently working on a book project that explores how citizens participate in political marketing campaigns in the digital age. Penny studies the relationship between people's use of social media and their own social and political advocacy. He noted recently that studies show that, quote, strong emotional reactions are the biggest motivating force for people to share content online, and that anger is the most motivating emotion, more than any positive emotion, a relevant point in today's heated political environment. Joel received his bachelor's degree from Northwestern University, his master's from the University of Pennsylvania, and his doctorate also at Penn's Annenberg School. We'll talk today about social media and the current political climate. Welcome, Joel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you here. Let's jump right in. So it's a social media election season in many ways. The leading Republican candidate, Donald Trump, using Twitter and other social media very aggressively, and the Democratic contenders also engaging in frequent conversation, shall we say, in social media. What's the role of social media in this election, and how do you see it?
Well, it's another outreach tool for campaigns in terms of the politicians themselves. You know, they've realized they have to be on all these platforms. You know, Twitter is one of the most popular, also Instagram. They're really on every single platform where they're going to reach voters, right? I mean, the same way that politicians have used radio and television, now they realize they have to use social media. At this point, it's pretty standard practice.
What's different about things this year? How has this advanced, if you will?
Well, I think that at least in terms of politicians' use of social media, certainly with the Donald Trump campaign, you've seen this kind of taken to a new level where now candidates, I mean, in his case, he's really speaking in the language and the tone of much of social media, which is kind of, I think in that case, pretty new because, typically candidates try to play it safe. They want to have sort of an official kind of formal address to their voters. What Donald Trump has realized is that people are actually receptive to candidates that is talking on social media the way that other people talk on social media, which is usually a lot more informal, of course, very brief, but also very heated, very emotional, often very angry, as you were mentioning at the beginning. So that's something he's really kind of proving a point that social media style discourse is now more commonplace and more accepted in terms of our political conversation.
Trump's use of social media, consistent with the point you reminded me about anger, makes a lot of sense, right? Because he is captivating or capturing a good deal of the anger that apparently exists in the electorate.
Yeah, and of course, he also has television coverage like no other candidate either. I mean, he's in a kind of unique position as a celebrity that he gets all kinds of media attention. So, of course, he's using social media as well, and every time he does that, he gets other kinds of press coverage, right? So, what he's tweeted then becomes a news story or an Instagram video that his campaign puts out. So it's kind of a hybrid cycle back and forth between what we would call traditional media, television, for instance, and digital social media.
Do you view this level of engagement as a positive thing, pro-democratic and so forth, that small d democratic?
Well, I think what it does is it gets people, it draws people into the political process. And I'm not speaking just specifically about Trump here, but in general, this is where most people are. They're on these platforms. They're on, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and they're in terms of looking at their feeds. This political stuff pops up at the same place that they're seeing, entertainment. They're seeing messages from their friends and their family. So in a way, the fact that politics is now part of the larger social media conversation makes it more accessible, makes it more entertaining enough in many cases with all these memes that go around, which hope we can talk about. But in that case, it's bringing an entry point in for people to get interested. Of course, they're going to encounter it a lot more where they haven't before. In the past, if you were, for instance, watching TV and the news comes on, you can turn it off. But now social media it throws it all together, right? So when you check your Instagram feed, political posts are going to pop up right next to your friends' birthday pictures. So in that sense, it really does create a more kind of culturally friendly, accessible environment for politics, and that could be a positive in terms of overall engagement. It gets people more interested.
Anything particularly notable about Clinton and Sanders and what they're doing in social media this time around?
Well, I think the Bernie Sanders campaign is probably the biggest social media story of this election. I mean, with Trump, he's getting all kinds of media attention, including TV, but Bernie Sanders has really relied on the social media buzz, as it were. And a lot of it's not kind of coming top down. He's been pretty savvy as well as using Twitter. Sometimes he's responding now to Trump in certain cases. But it's really his supporters and this kind of movement that we've seen around several other candidates in the past, most notably Barack Obama, where there's a lot of grassroots enthusiasm and support, and people spreading around viral content, memes. In this election, it's #FeelTheBurn, right? As well as other kinds of pop culture-oriented memes. And that's really what brought, Bernie Sanders, in many ways, from this relatively obscure candidate into being such a major force in the election. Whether or not he wins, it's a huge story. It turns out, he may not, looks like he may not win this primary, but the fact that he's gotten as far as he did, and really, became a major force in the political scene more generally, a lot of people are tracing that back to the energy around his social media supporters, really less the campaign and more the kind of what you might call fandom. I've looked a lot of this in my research. A lot of what we're seeing now in terms of political social media, in terms of what everyday people do, really looks a lot like fandom in terms of popular culture. And Bernie has his fans, very passionate ones who are always online, always ready to comment and spread things around. And that really helped him rise from obscurity to, the fact where he could actually be competitive with Hillary Clinton, who had so much more name recognition, so much more, going for her in terms of where the campaign started.
Sanders always stresses the average campaign donation as $27.
Yeah.
Making the point that his fan base, or his supporters, more importantly, are quite small donors. How much of that is social media driven?
Well, a lot of it is social media driven, right? I mean, the donations are often through the website. So every time that they can pull people in online, that's an opportunity for a donation. So yeah, we're now seeing a crowdfunding kind of model, the same way, a Kickstarter campaign might help somebody get their project off the ground. In many ways, this was kind of a Kickstarter campaign for Bernie Sanders. And yeah, all of that has to do with the kind of what we call online word of mouth, the sort of buzz that happens when people start talking about this and sharing it with their friends. So yeah, I mean, you really do see, if you're talking about social media having real effects, one of the real effects is that it creates a lot of opportunities to kind of pitch the fundraising operation. To donate here, it brings people in a very powerful way because, right, he has at this point a lot of cash continuing to come in. He can stay in the race because of all those small donations that come in through his website.
Tell us about the memes that are of note in this campaign. You made that point a moment ago in passing.
Well, it's interesting. I don't think a lot of the politicians themselves are really fully comfortable with engaging on this level. Sometimes they get criticized for it, which I think is probably unfair because it probably works. It gets people interested. But most of it is happening. Well, I just remember, for instance, I mean, maybe not quote meme, but a viral video several years back. Governor Chris Christie put out this kind of viral style YouTube video that was very kind of entertainment pop culture referencing. And he got a lot of heat from that from the Democrats in the state. They said this is not dignified, this is not official enough for somebody who is heading the office of the governor. But really this is the kind of discourse that is popular, it's happening online all the time, and why shouldn't politicians get involved in this? A lot of it, in this campaign and in others, certainly going several elections back, there's so much been happening at the grassroots level. People, Photoshop the candidates into various things. I think particularly what these memes are about is sort of telling narratives and kind of ways of framing the candidates in the election in terms of popular culture reference points. So one of the ones, for instance, I saw with this campaign was people sort of setting up Bernie Sanders as Doc from Back to the Future and Trump as Biff, another character. Apparently, Biff was based on Trump originally for the film.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so this was at least in Back to the Future Part 2, where he becomes this sort of big businessman. Anyway, yeah, so people are very savvy about that, making these pop culture references and comparison points. And again, as I was saying before, it's a way in for people. It's a way for people to understand. Popular culture is our culture. It's a way that we make sense of the world. So why not have a conversation that compares politicians to celebrities and to films and to TV shows? That's what you're seeing over and over again in terms of social media. So yeah, I mean, that's, I think, probably a more interesting and perhaps less reported on phenomenon. I mean, sometimes it gets attention, but there's a lot going on at the grassroots that's not coming from the campaigns on down, but it's coming from the bottom up.
For example?
Well, just simply all of these, memes. Well, there's another one, for instance, just thinking about Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, where they would sort of compare them on a different issue, usually as a joke, right? A lot of the stuff is funny. So they say, Bernie Sanders says this about an issue, and Hillary Clinton says something more silly. I think those were often used by, the Bernie Sanders supporters. But again, it's always humorous. 9 times out of 10 or more, memes. The way people define them in terms of how we talk about that word now, it often means an internet joke that gets spread around and kind of modified and changed as it mutates, as it kind of gets spread around. And so humor is a way for people to get into politics as well. I mean, we've seen so much more broadly, right? Everything from The Daily Show to all kinds of satire on TV. Where now, the political conversation is often a comedy-based conversation. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not serious. So people can make a lot of very important points using humor as a tool.
I can't quite tell whether you're saying this is a positive development in terms of the democratic process or whether this is frivolous and diverting.
Well, I think it's very, there's some ambivalence there.
Right.
Because the humor, it can be seen as frivolous and trivializing. That's a critique that's been around for a long time about the way that we kind of filter politics through media. But it also can be very engaging and get people involved. So I would certainly say there's a mixed bag. There's some positives and negatives to this. The big threat about this, you mentioned things like the frivolity of the conversation, is that maybe it becomes too much about kind of style and image and people just enjoying the surface level of the humor and ridiculousness of the campaign. And that actually comes to sort of supplant or replace the real, more serious conversation about issues, about policy. So I think the ultimate kind of problem that could happen or sort of negative would be, for instance, if people are voting for Trump because they just enjoy the humor and the kind of media spectacle of it all, or even another candidate, that it just becomes so much about the politics as entertainment that we sort of lose the political in the process. I don't necessarily think that always has to happen if you're talking, for instance, about memes. What I talk about a lot in the research that I'm doing is all of this media and sort of symbolic communication of all kinds that happens online is really about making meanings out of our world, understanding things and really understanding what they mean. So as long as the memes or the viral videos can be connected back to some real deeper meaning, then I don't think they necessarily have to be trivializing or bad for democracy. But there's also a risk of becoming meaningless, which is certainly a threat that's out there.
And hasn't this election demonstrated again the fact that traditional media is less and less important in these political conversations than it was, say, 20 years ago?
Well, traditional media in terms of things like television?
Television, radio, newspapers, magazines, et cetera.
Well, certainly in terms of political ads. I mean, famously, this is the election where political ads have flopped, right? So, Jeb Bush at one point had all these super PACs spending all this money on TV ads, and it seemed to do absolutely nothing. And maybe even it harmed him. And that has to do with a lot of, if you look at what's going on in the world of advertising and marketing, traditional one-way communication, marketing communication of buying ads is seen as much less trusted, much less persuasive. What is persuasive is word of mouth, peer-to-peer recommendations. And so marketers are now all about talking about the commercial promotional fields. They're about creating virality. Viral marketing is now the status quo. They're not just thinking about the traditional model. So we're seeing the same thing in political marketing and political communication. People just don't trust the 30-second ads that pop up on TV, but they are willing to entertain things that get sent around the internet because it has this sense of grassroots authenticity. It's all about authenticity. Traditional advertising is seen as very inauthentic, but all the stuff that happens in terms of people sharing things on Facebook and Twitter has that, again, authentic sensibility where people think, oh, this is coming from a real person, so maybe this is actually something I should look at.
Although we share political ads with our social media friends in vastly different ways. I remember just a few months ago, the Bernie Sanders ad using the Simon and Garfunkel song "America" was extremely effective and shared millions of times by people. In recent weeks, some actors and actresses have read Donald Trump quotes about women in particular. That ad has been shared very widely. It was produced by, I guess, a PAC that's trying to prevent the Trump nomination. So we use ads differently, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, now ads are more produced to function as viral videos. And the idea is to create something that's such a talking point that has so much interest around it that people will voluntarily go out and seek it and share it. And that's different from the older model with television. It was much more kind of a push kind of marketing where people will just they just throw it on the air in between with their favorite TV show, and it kind of comes in as an invasion. So that's often one of the reasons why people ignore it. People like to block out that kind of advertising when it's sort of thrust upon them. But if it's something like viral video, it's people seeking it out on themselves and sharing it with their friends. And this is again the same thing that's happening in commercial marketing. Advertisers are increasingly trying to create content that is viral, whether or not it really has anything to do with the product, for instance, or is sort of not as important as does it kind of speak the language of internet viral videos in terms of getting people to react strongly in an emotional sense. So the ads you mentioned, for instance, are probably the ones that actually do go viral, have some emotional quality to them that might be missing from the kind of standard kind of cut and paste TV ads that we've seen for so many generations, from the 50s onward, at least on television.
Tempting as it is to spend all our time talking about the campaign, let's not, and let's talk about some other matters that you do research into. So obviously social media has a great deal to do with social movements these days. Occupy Wall Street comes to mind, there are others. What's the relevance these days of social media to political movements, especially from the grassroots?
Well, it's created a whole new opportunity for organizing. A lot of these movements now are really powered by social media, people finding each other who are like-minded, and sometimes that means organizing, taking something that's online and going offline. I mean, Occupy Wall Street was a great example of that. It was sending around, it was kind of a meme in a sense of hashtag Occupy Wall Street, and then the people who were, tweeting this and kind of getting involved in that level, a lot of them ended up showing up in person and getting involved in these, protests and occupations. The Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, very much a similar story. It really got a lot of traction online. We call it hashtag Black Lives Matter for a reason. It comes from this environment.
That. It's not just an identifier. Right. That's the genesis of the movement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's more complicated than that, right? I mean, there's a lot of going on in terms of organizations that, there is actually a Black Lives Matter organization that has kind of gotten off the ground. But the internet and, particularly the social media, I'd say Twitter is a big hotbed for this. It's a place for all kinds of movements to get going. It doesn't really necessarily end there, right? It can move into offline organizing and protesting, or it could just sort of be forgotten about, like so many memes kind of here today, gone tomorrow.
Well, and that's the critique, right? The critique is that one can be confused about the real meaning of social media-based movements because unless it really involves follow-through and organization and coalition building, like, say, the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, it may not have the same value and people may not really appreciate what's going on here, right?
Well, it's very interesting. And a lot of researchers are looking a lot at this question of how is political organizing different in the era of social media and the internet. And,
including yourself.
Yeah, including myself. And the sort of body of thinking now seems to suggest that there is a fundamental difference. For instance, if you look at Occupy Wall Street and, I guess Black Lives Matter in a sense too, there's a sense that they are leaderless movements, that they're not so much a top-down hierarchical organization like the kind that you saw, for instance, in the 60s with the civil rights movement organizations. They're not, top-down. They are these networks. There are some scholars who say we've moved from an era of collective action to an era of connective action, where people are no longer, coming together in the old way, but they're sort of connecting online and kind of doing things in tandem with each other, coordinating, using the internet as a coordinating tool. But it's much more decentralized, right? I mean, in general, the internet is a decentralized communication medium, and what that translates to when you get to the political field is decentralized movements. There is really no leadership, for instance, of the Black Lives Matter movement. There are some major voices. There are people who, there were actually 3 activists who started it who were seen as kind of spokespeople on some level. And there's been attempts to organize certain groups, right? There's a lot of groups, but anybody can become a member of this movement if you're hashtagging it, if you're showing up to whatever sort of almost flash mob kind of style of protest that gets arranged online. They're very much, they're open networks. There's not a sense of traditional organizational membership. And that has been criticized because some people say, oh, you need leaders in order to effectively, advocate for change, really push through policy and lobby, Congress, for instance, that leadership still plays a role. But there's trade-offs again. These new movements are much more decentralized. As I say, they're networks. They don't have leaders, but they also can get very big very fast because of that sense of openness. Everybody just kind of come in, use the hashtag, start getting involved in the conversation, and you're already part of this phenomenon. Whether you want to call it an organization, it's a kind of movement.
And yet the critique, as I put it before, of things like Occupy Wall Street and even the Middle East, the spring in the Middle East, was that the Arab Spring, that a lot of organizing very quickly, a lot of engagement, a lot of people in the streets, and yet not really sustained movements, as in, again, the contrasted example is the civil rights movement. Are people learning from this? I mean, what has been the fallout of Occupy Wall Street, really? It's kind of gone, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting, what happened with Occupy Wall Street. I would say it's fed right into the Bernie Sanders campaign. If you look at the people who are organizing, who got started at the beginning, organizing for Bernie Sanders and putting out, I think the activist, I actually looked into this, who started the hashtag Feel the Burn, came out of the Occupy movement. A lot of those early people. So they've actually managed to kind of channel that energy into that campaign. And at the time they were like, let's put income inequality on the lips of everyone in the country. Let's make it into an issue. That was kind of the effect that they were going for with all these activities around Occupy Wall Street. And now you have a major presidential candidate who says nothing but income equality all day long. And so there is a sense that this kind of, a lot of what people say with this kind of activism online is change the conversation. And does that really affect anything? Does that change anything? Well, it doesn't necessarily, but there's opportunities there. It does require follow through. But yeah, I think that there has been a lot of, for instance, looking back at, you mentioned the Arab Spring, and the students who are mostly fairly I want to say left wing, but kind of more progressive in their country, coming together in Egypt to overthrow Mubarak. And there was a big power vacuum that they created. They didn't have the kind of leadership and organization to actually compete in their campaign, and it ended up the Muslim Brotherhood came in and won that election for a year.
Because they had been organized beforehand, right?
Yeah, they were much more of a traditional hierarchical organization. And so, yeah, when it comes down to it, those are the kinds of groups that end up often having success, although, the Muslim Brotherhood was kicked out by a military coup 1 year later. So actually, the Arab Spring for a while, but back in, people were talking about this in 2011, 2012, holding up the Arab Spring as saying, this is fantastic. This shows the power of social media for change. From our perspective a few years later, it looks like, whoa, maybe, it can create a lot of disruption, but it may be really lacking in the sense of organizing a kind of apparatus that can really, take control politically, do things on a level of, the world that we live in, which is government, which is policy, and elections, things like that. So there's a lot of sort of questioning there about whether this whole idea of leaderless networks really is going to translate into something that's going to make a real change.
And to the quote in the intro that I used of yours about anger really fueling this, are there examples where maybe that's not the only motivating force? It is unfortunate that it takes anger to get social media activism going. It would be nice if more positive things were developing on social media as well.
Well, I will say actually, when they do these studies about what what content gets shared on the internet most, what goes viral, this has been a big question for many fields now. Everybody wants to know, how do you make a viral video, what goes viral? So they do these experiments and they find that it's strong emotional responses. And anger is often one of the leading ones, but the other biggest leading one, and you can kind of see this when you play out in terms of everyday viral videos, is inspiration. This is the whole kind of Upworthy model. They're not as big as they were a few years ago, but creating inspiring videos, things that people get all teared up about. That's a positive emotion. So for instance, I mean, even just saying, how did that Bernie Sanders with the Simon and Garfunkel song go viral? They were really going for that kind of heart-tugging, inspirational message. And so there is a lot of that happening online as well. And so you see that certainly playing out in the election. You see that playing out all over the place. So there is, strong emotional responses don't necessarily have to be negative. Anger does seem to be one of, obviously one of the leading ones, but that sense of, getting, heart-tugging, tugging on your heartstrings, that's true for both what they're doing in commercial marketing as well as, political communication and advocacy.
We only have about a minute left, but from a crystal ball point of view, what do you see ahead in the role social media will play in political activism?
Well, it's going to continue to be more and more a centerpiece of media strategy. Obviously, a lot more than, for instance, running those traditional 30-second TV ads. But I would say the biggest, prediction, I would say, and I've been saying this for a while before, for instance, the Trump campaign started, I was saying this, just think, if people think that we're sort of, delving down into the sort of muck of, the kinds of tone and discourse that people use on social media, that informal, often very brusque and very humorous and kind of satirical and not so proper and official and dignified, that's just going to keep getting more and more prominent. Any politician who wants to say, oh, I'm going to take the high road here and not engage on the level of memes and hashtags and that's just simply where we are as a culture. And politicians have to reach the people. They have to reach out to the culture. So, talking about stooping down to the level, it's going to keep getting lower and lower, unfortunately, in many cases.
My prediction, it'll be an extraordinary social media summer, especially as we get to the political conventions. Joel, thanks for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
If you'd like more information about this episode of Carpe Diem or any other Carpe Diem, you can write to us at the email address on your screen, carpediem@mail.montclair.edu, or call us at 973-655-5158. For Carpe Diem, I'm Merrill Brown. Thanks for watching.